Welcome back. In our previous lesson, you learned how to filter data using the where clause. You also learned how to combine conditions using the and or operators. But today, we're going one step further. Let me ask you an interesting question. Do you think writing the correct SQL query always guarantees the correct result? The answer is not always. Imagine two SQL queries that look almost identical. They use the same table, the same conditions, and even the same operators. But surprisingly, they can return completely different results. Why does that happen? Because SQL Server doesn't just read your query from left to right. It follows its own logical evaluation rules. If you don't understand those rules, a single mistake can return the wrong records. And that's one of the most common mistakes beginners make. In this lesson, we're going to understand how SQL Server actually evaluates multiple conditions. We'll explore logical operators in much greater depth. We'll learn when to use and, when to use or, and how combining them incorrectly can completely change your results. More importantly, you'll start thinking like a professional SQL developer instead of simply memorizing SQL syntax. By the end of this lesson, you'll understand the logic behind SQL filtering, and you'll be able to write smarter, more accurate SQL queries with confidence. So, are you ready? Let's dive deeper into the world of logical operators. Do you think writing the correct SQL query always guarantees the correct result? No, even a small logical mistake can produce completely different results. This creates curiosity and naturally introduces the lesson. Real-world analogy. Imagine you're hiring employees. The requirement says, candidates must have a bachelor's degree and 2 years of experience or a professional certification. Now think carefully. Does the certification replace both requirements? Or does it replace only the experience requirement? Depending on how you interpret the sentence, you'll shortlist completely different candidates. SQL Server faces the same challenge. That's why understanding logical evaluation is so important. Key learning outcomes. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to understand how SQL Server evaluates multiple conditions. Use and not with confidence. Avoid common logical mistakes made by beginners. Write more accurate and reliable SQL queries. Think logically before writing SQL statements. Golden rule. Writing SQL is easy. Writing the correct logic is what makes you a SQL professional. In the previous lesson, we learned about the and or operators. But today, let's understand what they actually are. They belong to a special category called logical operators. So what exactly is a logical operator? A logical operator is used to combine one or more conditions and help SQL Server decide whether a row should be included in the result. In simple words, logical operators help SQL Server make decisions. Every time SQL Server evaluates a condition, the answer is always one of two possibilities: true or false. Based on that result, SQL Server decides whether a particular row should be returned. For example, imagine we write this condition: salary is greater than 50,000. SQL Server checks every employee one by one. If an employee's salary is greater than 50,000, the condition becomes true. If the salary is less than or equal to 50,000, the condition becomes false. Now suppose we have two conditions instead of one. That's where logical operators become important. They tell SQL Server how those conditions should be evaluated. There are three main logical operators in SQL: and, or, and, not. The and operator returns true only when every condition is true. The or operator returns true when at least one condition is true. And the not operator simply reverses the result. If a condition is true, not makes it false. If a condition is false, not makes it true. Don't worry if this sounds new. In the next few slides, We'll understand each logical operator with simple examples and real-world scenarios. By the end of this lesson, you'll know exactly when to use and, or, and not in your SQL queries. Can SQL Server think like a human? No, SQL Server doesn't guess or assume. It simply evaluates every condition as true or false. Logical operators help SQL Server combine those results and make the correct decision. This helps students understand that SQL is based on logic rather than intuition. Real-world analogy. Imagine a security guard standing at the entrance of a company. Before allowing someone inside, the guard checks a few conditions. Is the person carrying a valid ID card? Is today a working day? Is the employee authorized to enter? The guard makes a decision only after evaluating these conditions. SQL Server works in exactly the same way. It checks every condition, evaluates it as true or false, and then decides whether a row should be included in the final result. Key points to emphasize. Logical operators are used with the where clause. They combine one or more conditions. SQL Server evaluates every condition as true or false. And, or, and not are the three primary logical operators. They control which rows appear in the final result set. Golden rule. Logical operators don't store data. They help SQL Server make the right decision about which data to return. Now let's take a deeper look at the AND operator. In the previous lesson, we learned that AND combines multiple conditions. But today, we're going to understand exactly how SQL Server evaluates those conditions. Here's the most important rule you should remember. The AND operator returns true only when every condition is true. Even if one condition becomes false, the entire expression becomes false. Let's understand this with an example. Suppose we want to find employees who satisfy two requirements. First, their salary must be greater than $50,000. And second, they must work in the IT department. Our SQL query looks like this. Select empid, name, department, salary. From employees, where salary 50,000. And department equals it. Now let's see what SQL Server does behind the scenes. It starts with the first employee. Is the salary greater than 50,000? Yes. Is the department IT? Yes. Since both conditions are true, SQL Server includes that employee in the result. Next, SQL Server checks another employee. The salary is greater than 50,000. But the employee works in the HR department. The first condition is true. The second condition is false. Because one condition failed, SQL Server rejects that row. It continues checking every employee in exactly the same way. Only the employees who satisfy both conditions appear in the final result. This is why the AND operator is considered a strict operator. It doesn't accept partial matches. Every condition must be satisfied before SQL Server returns the row. So whenever you need highly accurate and specific results, the AND operator is usually the right choice. Which area will SQL Server return? Only the overlapping area. The employee must satisfy both conditions. Meeting just one condition is not enough. This helps students visualize why the AND operator narrows the result set. Real-world analogy. Imagine you're applying for a software developer job. The company has two requirements. You must have a bachelor's degree. You must have at least 3 years of experience. If you have the degree but no experience, you don't qualify. If you have experience but no degree, you still don't qualify. You must satisfy both requirements. The AND operator works exactly the same way in SQL Server. Key points to emphasize. AND combines multiple conditions. Every condition must evaluate to true. If even one condition is false, the row is excluded. AND produces a smaller and more precise result set. It is best used when all specified conditions are mandatory. Golden rule. AND means all. If one condition fails, the entire condition fails. Now that we've understood how the AND operator works, let's explore another very important logical operator, the OR operator. Although AND and OR are both used to combine conditions, they behave very differently. The OR operator is much more flexible. Here's the rule you should remember. The OR operator returns true if at least one condition is true. It doesn't require every condition to be satisfied. Just one matching condition is enough. Let's understand this with an example. Suppose we want to find employees who either earn more than 50,000 or employees who work in the IT department. Our SQL query looks like this. Select employee, name, department, salary. From employees, where salary 50,000 or department equals it. Now let's see how SQL Server evaluates each employee. The first employee earns more than 50,000 and also works in the IT department. Both conditions are true, so SQL Server returns that row. The second employee works in the HR department, but the salary is still greater than 50,000. Even though one condition is false, the other condition is true. So SQL Server still returns that employee. Now let's look at another employee. The salary is only 45,000, but the employee belongs to the IT department. Again, one condition is true, so SQL Server includes that row as well. Finally, imagine an employee whose salary is below 50,000 and who does not belong to the IT department. Now both conditions are false. Only in this situation does SQL Server reject the row. This is the biggest difference between AND and OR. AND is strict. OR is flexible. That's why the OR operator usually returns more rows than the AND operator. Whenever your requirement says this condition or that condition, the OR operator is the correct choice. Point to the sample data on the slide and ask, does this employee satisfy at least one condition? Check each row together with the students. If the answer is yes, SQL Server returns that row. It doesn't matter whether the other condition is true or false. This reinforces the core behavior of the OR operator. Real-world analogy. Imagine a college announces, students from the computer science department or students who scored above 90% are eligible for a scholarship. If you're from computer science, you qualify. If you scored above 90%, you also qualify. You don't have to satisfy both conditions. Meeting either one is enough. That's exactly how the OR operator works in SQL Server. Key points to emphasize. OR combines multiple conditions. At least one condition must be true. If all conditions are false, the row is excluded. OR produces a broader result set than AND. It is ideal when multiple possible conditions are acceptable. Golden rule. OR means any. If at least one condition is true, SQL Server returns the row. So far, we've learned about two logical operators. AND returns true only when all conditions are true. OR returns true when at least one condition is true. Now, let's learn the third logical operator. NOT. The NOT operator is different from both AND and OR. It doesn't combine conditions. Instead, it simply reverses the result of a condition. In other words, if a condition is true, the NOT operator changes it to false. And if a condition is false, the NOT operator changes it to true. Let's understand this with a simple example. Suppose we want to find employees who are not working in the IT department. Our SQL query looks like this. Select employee, name, department. From employees, where not department equals it. Now let's see how SQL Server evaluates this query. It checks the first employee. Is the employee in the IT department? Yes. Since the condition is true, the NOT operator reverses it to false. So SQL Server does not return that employee. Next, SQL Server checks another employee. Is the employee in the IT department? No. The condition is false. The NOT operator changes false to true. Therefore, SQL Server includes that employee in the result. It repeats the same process for every row in the table. Finally, the result contains every employee except those who belong to the IT department. This is why the not operator is commonly used whenever we want to exclude specific values instead of including them. It gives us a simple way to ask SQL Server, "Show me everything except this." Once you understand the not operator, you'll be able to write much more flexible and powerful filtering conditions. If I say, "Do not enter this room," what does that mean? Let them answer. Exactly, you're excluding one specific place. The not operator works the same way. It tells SQL Server to exclude the values that match the condition. This makes the concept easy to remember. Real-world analogy. Imagine a school announces, "Students who are not in grade 10 should assemble in the auditorium." What happens? Grade 10 students stay where they are. Every other student is included. That's exactly how the NOT operator works in SQL. It excludes the values that match the condition and returns everything else. Key points to emphasize. Not reverses the result of a condition. True becomes false. False becomes true. Not is commonly used to exclude specific values. It can be combined with other SQL operators for more advanced filtering. Golden rule. Think of not as the opposite switch. It simply tells SQL Server, "Return everything except what matches this condition." So far, we've learned each logical operator individually. We learned how AND works. We learned how OR works. And we also learned how not reverses a condition. But in real-world SQL development, we rarely use just one logical operator. Most SQL queries combine multiple operators together. That's why it's important to understand how they work as a team. Let's look at the example on this slide. Our requirement is, find employees who earn more than $60,000 and work in the IT department. Or, employees who work in the HR department. But we do not want employees from the finance department. Our SQL query combines and, or, and not in a single statement. At first glance, this query may look complicated. But SQL Server doesn't get confused. It evaluates each condition step by step. First, it checks the conditions connected by AND. Then it evaluates the conditions connected by OR. Wherever not is used, SQL Server reverses that particular condition before producing the final result. Each employee is checked against every condition. If the combined logic evaluates to true, that employee appears in the result. If the final result is false, SQL Server skips that employee. This is exactly how complex business rules are written in real-world applications. For example, a company may want to generate a report for employees who belong to multiple departments, meet certain salary requirements, and exclude specific categories of employees. All of that is possible by combining logical operators correctly. As your SQL skills improve, you'll use these combinations more and more often. The key is to think about the business requirement first. Then translate that requirement into SQL conditions. That's how professional SQL developers solve real-world problems. Which employees satisfy the AND condition? Which employees satisfy the OR condition? After applying not, which employees should be excluded? Real-world analogy. Imagine a company is preparing a list of employees for an advanced training program. The rules are: employees from the IT department with a salary above Rupee 60,000 can join. Or any employee from the HR department can also join. But employees from the finance department should not be included. Instead of checking each employee manually, SQL Server applies all these rules automatically and returns the correct list. This is exactly how logical operators are used in real business applications. Key points to emphasize. Real-world SQL queries often combine multiple logical operators. Complex conditions should be understood one step at a time. Every row is evaluated against the complete logical expression. Combining operators allows SQL to represent real business rules accurately. Clear logic leads to accurate query results. Golden rule. Think like a problem solver first and a SQL programmer second. Good SQL is simply business logic written as code. Now that you've learned how and, or, and not work, let's look at something that every SQL beginner experiences. Common mistakes. The good news is, these mistakes are completely normal. Every SQL developer has made them at some point. The important thing is learning how to recognize and avoid them. Let's look at the first mistake. Beginners often choose the wrong logical operator. They use AND when the requirement actually needs OR. Or they use OR when the requirement clearly needs AND. Remember, before writing your SQL query, always read the requirement carefully. Ask yourself, do all conditions need to be true? If the answer is yes, use AND. If only one condition needs to be true, use OR. Another common mistake is forgetting to use the NOT operator when the requirement says except, exclude, or not equal to. Whenever you see these words, think about whether NOT should be part of your query. Beginners also make mistakes by assuming the result without testing it. Never assume your query is correct just because it executes successfully. Always verify the output. Compare the result with the business requirement. Ask yourself, did I really get the records I wanted? Professional SQL developers don't just write queries. They validate every result before using it. That's an important habit you should develop from the very beginning. Remember, writing SQL is only half the job. Making sure the result is correct is the other half. If your SQL query runs without any errors, does that always mean the result is correct? Many beginners will answer yes. Not necessarily. A query can execute perfectly and still return the wrong data if the logical conditions don't match the requirement. This teaches students to focus on correctness, not just syntax. Real-world analogy. Imagine a teacher asks, bring only the students who scored above 90 marks. Instead, someone brings students who scored above 90 or students who wear blue uniforms. The instruction was followed incorrectly. The list is larger than expected. The problem isn't with the students. The problem is with understanding the requirement. SQL works the same way. If you misunderstand the requirement, your query may return incorrect results even though the SQL statement itself is valid. Key points to emphasize. Read the requirement carefully before choosing AND, or not. Don't guess which operator to use. Always test your query with sample data. Verify that the returned rows match the business requirement. A query without syntax errors can still produce incorrect results if the logic is wrong. Golden rule. A successful SQL query is not one that runs without errors. It's one that returns the correct data. We've now learned how the AND, or, and NOT operators work individually. But learning SQL isn't just about understanding concepts. It's about applying those concepts to solve real business problems. That's exactly what professional SQL developers do every day. Let's look at a few practical examples. Example 1. A company wants a list of employees who work in the IT department and earn more than $50,000. Since both conditions must be satisfied, we use the AND operator. Example 2. The HR department wants employees who either belong to the HR department or earn more than $60,000. Here, either condition is acceptable, so we use the OR operator. Example 3. The finance manager wants a report that excludes employees from the finance department. Instead of selecting finance employees, we want everyone except them. This is the perfect situation to use the NOT operator. Finally, let's look at a slightly more realistic example. Suppose the management wants employees who work in the IT department or the sales department. whose salary is greater than 50,000, but who are not located in Chennai. This requirement combines and, or, and not together. As you can see, once you understand each logical operator, combining them becomes much easier. This is how SQL is used in real companies. Reports, dashboards, employee management, banking systems, hospital applications, e-commerce websites. Every business needs to filter data based on specific conditions. And that's why logical operators are one of the most important skills every SQL developer should master. My advice is simple. Don't just read these examples. Type every query yourself. Change the values. Modify the conditions. Observe how the results change. That's the fastest way to build confidence in SQL. Why did we choose this operator? What is the business requirement? Requirement right arrow, choose the operator. Write the query. Predict the result. Execute the query. Verify the output. Real-world analogy. Imagine you're shopping online. You might search for laptops costing less than 60,000 and having at least 16 GB RAM, or phones from Samsung or Google, or products not marked as out of stock. Every time you apply filters on a shopping website, you're using the same logical thinking that SQL uses behind the scenes. Key points to emphasize. Logical operators solve real business problems. Choose the operator based on the requirement, not by guessing. Test your queries with sample data. Verify the output before using it in reports or applications. Practice with different combinations to strengthen your SQL skills. Golden rule. The best way to master SQL is simple. Practice real-world problems until choosing the right logical operator becomes second nature. Congratulations! You've successfully completed Lesson 9 of our SQL Server course. In this lesson, we moved beyond simply knowing the logical operators. We learned how to use them with confidence. We started by understanding what logical operators are and why they play such an important role in SQL. Then we explored the three most important logical operators: and, or, and not. We learned that the AND operator returns a row only when every condition is true. The OR operator returns a row when at least one condition is true. And the NOT operator reverses a condition, helping us exclude unwanted records. After that, we learned how these operators can be combined to solve real-world business problems. We also discussed some of the most common mistakes beginners make, and more importantly, how to avoid them. Finally, we solved practical examples that showed how logical operators are used in real SQL projects. Remember, learning SQL isn't about memorizing commands. It's about understanding the logic behind every query you write. When your logic is correct, your results will be correct. So don't stop here. Open SQL Server. Rewrite every example from this lesson. Change the conditions. Experiment with different values. Observe how the results change. That's how real SQL skills are built. If you found this lesson helpful, please take a moment to like this video, share it with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to JeyBTechAcademy for more practical SQL Server lessons. Also, don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss our upcoming lessons. In our next lesson, we'll learn about operator precedence and parentheses, and discover how SQL Server decides the order in which multiple conditions are evaluated. This is one of the most important concepts for writing complex SQL queries correctly. Thank you for watching. Keep practicing, keep building, and I'll see you in Lesson 10. Closing message. Good SQL isn't just about writing queries. It's about writing the right logic to return the right data. See you in Lesson 10. Rock it.